Welcome to 35 West. I'm Chris Hernandez-Roy, Deputy Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and co-host of the 35 West podcast.
With how professional the Mexican government.
Are we ready? I don't think.
Reform trends in Argentina.
Right. And that's what happened.
Role at all in the NAFTA negotiations.
Welcome to 35 West. I'm Chris Hernandez-Roy, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and the co-host of the 35 West podcast. On March 23rd, newly minted Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney called snap elections for April 28th, kicking off a 37-day campaign to determine Canada's future at a critical moment. The race puts incumbent Prime Minister Carney, who assumed leadership of the Liberal Party following Justin Trudeau's resignation as Prime Minister, head-to-head with Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. Until recently, the Liberals were long predicted to face a landslide defeat, with the Conservatives leading voting survey since April 2022. In early January, polls gave the Conservative Party a whopping 98% chance of forming the next government, the best polling results since 1988. But President Trump's tit-for-tat tariffs and musings about annexation, along with Mark Carney's appearance in the political spotlight, has shifted the momentum, bringing the Liberal Party back into the electoral race. As of April 10, polls give the Liberals an 85% chance of winning a majority. The third and fourth place parties, the New Democratic Party and the Bloc Québécois, are seeing their support evaporate. Regardless of who comes out on top, the next leader of Canada will inherit a tense relationship with the United States, public pressure at home to revive Canada's economy, and an increasingly fraught global security environment that tests Canada's sovereignty. To help us understand where things stand and what this election means for the future of Canada and U.S.-Canada relations, we're delighted to be joined today by Paul Wells. Paul is a renowned journalist and author on Canadian politics and public affairs. He served as the lead political writer at Maclean's magazine for 19 years and has written several books, including his prize-winning book, The Longer I'm Prime Minister, Stephen Harper and Canada, and more recently, Justin Trudeau on the Ropes, Governing in Troubled Times, published last year. Thanks for joining us today, Paul.
I'm pleased to be invited.
In this episode, we'll delve into Canada's election landscape, the two frontrunners' political agendas, and the challenges the next Prime Minister will face in Canada's relationship with the United States. Canada's upcoming election has become a showdown between two very different visions for the country. Canada Strong under Liberal leader Mark Carney versus Canada First under Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. Can you begin by sketching a scene setter for our audience? Who are the frontrunners and what are the core messages driving their campaigns?
Your intro got at a lot of the dynamic of this campaign. It is an extraordinary turnaround from a situation where the Liberals under Justin Trudeau, who's led that party for more than a decade, were headed for almost certain defeat, to one where they're very well placed to win. All that happened is that they've replaced Trudeau with Mark Carney, who was the only person ever to be central bank governor in two G7 countries, in Canada and then in Britain. He led monetary policy in Britain through the Brexit process, which left him, frankly, more controversial in Britain than he is in Canada. In Canada, he's seen as a highly competent public servant from way back, but he's never been in politics. He's quite new to politics. Pierre Poilievre is nothing if not a political animal. He has been in Parliament since his early 20s. He's in his mid-40s now. He has never had significant employment outside of Parliament. He's an extraordinary political marketer, public speaker, sometimes demagogue, who has rallied all of the Conservative base and a little bit more and seemed set to lead the Conservatives to a majority government until Mark Carney showed up. And now they're arguing against this backdrop of the extraordinary sea change in Canada's relations with the United States. Not only that President Trump has been menacing and has already set about damaging the economic relationship with his tariffs, but that because the United States is capable of electing a Donald Trump twice, Canadians are starting to say to themselves, we can never rely on the United States again. Of course, the implications of that are vast, that they're only being sort of superficially debated, but that's the context for this amazing, tumultuous election campaign.
Until a few months ago, the election was going to be centered around domestic issues, including inflation and taxes, housing prices, and immigration, issues really of which have been in the political discourse in Canada for the last several years. However, as you mentioned, Trump's tit-for-tat tariffs on Canada and his annexation threats together with the appearance of Prime Minister Carney on the scene, has changed and scrambled all these dynamics. How have these developments influenced the main issues of the election and its likely outcome?
We were heading into a very useful debate about big domestic issues, including environmental policy, energy policy. Of course, the two are closely connected. Federalism and regional politics, because the resource hinterland is strongly concentrated in two provinces in the center west of the country, Alberta and Saskatchewan, to the extent that environmental policies are favored, resource exports are hobbled, and that leads to regional strains in the federation. Sort of second order issues included sort of wokeism, reactions to the Israel-Hamas crisis in the Middle East, questions of sort of whether Canada was pulling its weight in NATO. All of those issues still play, but Trump trumps all of it. Listeners who aren't Canadian might vaguely recall that President Trump took to calling Canada the 51st state, calling Justin Trudeau Governor Trudeau, and may think that he was just having a larf. But as far as any of us can ascertain, that goal of eventually annexing Canada and wrecking Canada's economy on the way to that goal was presidential policy, widely shared within the administration, parroted throughout his cabinet, and not questioned by anyone on the Republican side of the fence, and not opposed by enough of Canada's allies for us to feel secure. Now, I say was. Prime Minister Carney and President Trump have had one phone conversation. Of course, we have only sketchy details of what's happened, but since they had that phone conversation, President Trump has not called Canada the 51st state. I would give my teeth to know what on earth Carney said to Trump to get him to shut that down. But again, we can't know whether it's permanent. And in the meantime, we remain the victims of a garden variety tariff assault that risks ripping out the industrial center of the Canadian economy. So it's hard to concentrate on wokeism and defense spending when the neighbors have turned on you, which is how it feels from Canada.
Paul, can we stay for a minute on domestic issues? Can you kind of help us understand where the two leaders sit on the different issues? What is the difference between the two leaders on some of these domestic issues? Mark Carney, as you noted, was a former banker, both in Canada and Great Britain. He's seen as somebody who will steer the economy well. But conservatives are traditionally seen as pro-business. So both of them come really from a business angle. Some of these other domestic issues, what are the differences between the two leaders?
The terrain on which the election is being fought is essentially economic resilience as Canada tries to lessen its dependence on the United States. That includes things like lowering internal trade barriers between Canadian provinces, seeking export markets besides the United States, and the question of how aggressively to export Canada's natural resource wealth, which is valuable anywhere in the world. Our oil and natural gas would enter into fungible markets, but also our critical minerals help to build the sort of high-tech new economy and might also reintroduce some leverage in our relationships with the United States. So that's the context. Politics in Canada is sometimes not very left-right polarized. It's often strongly polarized on energy versus the environment. And Pierre Poilievre wants to essentially dismantle all environmental policy and export aggressively our oil and natural gas wealth through pipelines east and west to third markets, and to speed up approval for new development of critical minerals and rare earths and things like that. Carney has appropriated a lot of what used to be conservative policy on these fronts. He is also for resource exports. He's also for trade liberalization. But he is also maintaining a goal of net zero emissions by 2050, which would require really substantial investment in emissions reductions and would include carbon tax on large industrial emitters. The Liberals have amazed everyone by abandoning their carbon tax on consumers, which was a key irritant for a lot of the electorate. But Carney wants to keep the large industrial emitters carbon tax, whereas Poilievre would get rid of that too. And then the rest of it is a question of sort of trust and ability to deliver. Canadians are trying to puzzle out for themselves whether they trust this conservative who's never been a prime minister or this liberal prime minister who's never been a politician. Obviously, opinions are split. Whichever side wins, it's going to constitute a big leap of faith for voters.
There seems to be a real choice. And so sketching out the positions will really be very key for both of the politicians to make their positions clear to the electorate. Beyond what each of the politicians are saying during the campaign, what might an actual government led by Carney look like? And the same question for Pierre Poilievre were he to be elected.
It's extraordinary and, to my mind, quite frustrating the extent to which our parliamentary politics have been presidentialized in Canada, by which I mean it's very difficult for voters to get any information about the Conservative team, apart from Mr. Poilievre. He would field a cabinet of 25 to 35 members of parliament. Probably 20 or so have already been in parliament for some time, for years in some cases. But Poilievre campaigns alone, doesn't speak about other members of his team. And it's hard, especially for distracted voters who don't eat and sleep and breathe this stuff. It's hard for Canadians to get an image of what a Poilievre government would look like. On the other hand, Carney comes as the new leader of a party that's been in power for a decade. He's got a couple dozen experienced cabinet ministers. His problem is that most Canadians don't like what they achieved. The Trudeau government has only in the last several weeks become a Carney government, was seen as one that had a very shaky grasp of delivering on promises, really degraded state capacity so that large projects had a habit of going over budget and over schedule, and a kind of a constant sanctimony in their pronunciations that really graded voters the wrong way. And I mean, kind of the worst caricature of Biden-Harris Democrat schoolmarmishness has been a feature of the Trudeau Liberal government for several years. So Carney's got an experienced cabinet, but he doesn't like to talk about it because it's not very popular. And because he's trying to represent change even as he governs a party that's seeking re-election. Poilievre, I think he's got 4 or 5 at least really strong potential cabinet ministers. You never see them with him, which is a tactical choice that I find unfathomable.
Paul, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago Poilievre's desire to aggressively export Canadian energy. He also has a new Canada First economic action plan, which seeks to inject $500 billion into the economy over the next 5 years. The plan includes several proposals, such as cutting income taxes, creating a Keep Canadians Working Fund to support businesses impacted by President Trump's tariffs, and eliminating, as you mentioned, the carbon tax on industry, which goes further than Carney's plan on carbon. Do you think this plan will help ease Canada's economic pressures and make the country more resilient in the face of escalating U.S. tariffs?
It's an impressive set of offers that essentially, first of all, confirm Poilievre as a small government Reaganite conservative, I would argue, more than an authoritarian quasi-Trump figure. Poilievre, frankly, doesn't like to engage in debates over social issues, doesn't find them interesting, and wants to deregulate and tax cut his way to prosperity. Most of that $500 billion is not money that the government itself would inject, but money that would theoretically, Poilievre argues, be injected into the economy thanks to his pro-market policy choices. I remain skeptical when governments bank on money that would sort of appear from the air because they were demonstrating a kind of macroeconomic virtue. But it would be at least interesting to a lot of voters if all other issues hadn't been washed away by this question of what on earth are we going to do about Trumpism. And I mean, this Canada First economic action plan that Poilievre has been releasing in bits and pieces for months now. Last week, when he introduced it sort of in its entirety, brought it together as an integrated whole, it got close to no coverage. Not because Canadian news organizations refused to cover this serious campaign, but because we're just all running around like chickens with our heads cut off trying to figure out how to survive the Trump wave. And I know, because you can read it in his body language, that this is very frustrating for Mr. Poilievre.
Poilievre seemed to have a real winning hand, a really great formula attacking Prime Minister Trudeau's policies. He still seems to be using that playbook against Carney. Will this work, or does he need a different strategy against Mark Carney?
He has only in the last few days begun to try to moderate his appeal and present himself as a thoughtful fellow who isn't only a schoolyard scrapper. But most Canadians know him as a schoolyard scrapper. It's common, for instance, for party leaders to present themselves as thoughtful leaders and to assign combat roles to second figures. Poilievre has always been perfectly happy to be his own scrapper. He called the mayor of Montreal incompetent. He called the premier of the province of British Columbia wacko. He called lobbyists for the oil sector idiots 5 times in quick succession in an interview with Jordan Peterson. He wrote to Elon Musk in his capacity as CEO of X to get the CBC designated as state media. On X, he has wistfully talked about how he just wishes he could get Elon Musk to open up a Tesla factory in Canada. That didn't date well. Most Canadians, if they had a chance to talk to Elon Musk, would talk about something else. And they wonder why Poilievre wouldn't. He's an efficient, brutally efficient scrapper, political battler. He's devastating. We have our daily question period in the House of Commons. Nobody likes to face Poilievre when he's asking the questions in the House of Commons. But he's proven much more reluctant to take serious questioning of his own. He's got a very thin skin. And he's having a hard time shaking this idea that he may be an impressive political performer, but that's different from being an impressive political leader. And he's having a hard time closing the sale on himself as a potential government leader.
Paul, before we turn back to sort of U.S.-Canada relations, earlier you mentioned regional strains in the Confederation. And there have recently been some opinion pieces in Canadian newspapers about the possibility of Western provinces ceding from the Confederation. How will regional issues fare under either a Carney or a Poilievre government?
Well, traditionally, the Liberal Party has been the party of central Canadian economic elites, Toronto bankers, Montreal intellectuals. The kinds of voters who pool on the east and west coasts in the United States tend to pool in Ontario and Quebec in Canada. And the resource-producing hinterlands, who are often less frequently educated at fine universities and tend to depend, much more on sort of heavy industry, but frankly, offer just spectacular value added to the economy, are concentrated, especially in Alberta and to some extent in Saskatchewan. And so the mutual resentment and mistrust and misunderstanding between central Canada and Western Canada is much older than I am. But it's always aggravated when these questions are salient, when Canada's economy is not doing great, when productivity in Canada, which depends a lot on innovation in the resource extracting industries, is not going well. The Liberal Party has seemed over the last decade reluctant to even consider resource extraction as part of the Canadian economy. That's seen in Alberta and Saskatchewan as holding them back, penalizing them for existing, skimming money off of their economies to pay for the unproductive intellectuals and layabouts in central Canada. Carney has moved more smartly than I would have imagined towards outlining policies that would belatedly favor resource extraction and export, should calm tensions between central Canada and Western Canada. But those tensions have been growing for many years. And for a lot of voters in that part of the country, it sums to this. If another damn Liberal gets elected again, we're out of here. And they're not really interested in parsing the fine differences between Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney, because the entire rest of the Carney government would be the people they thought they were about to kick out. And so any new government, and especially a returning Liberal government, will have these tensions, this mutual hostility to worry about. I think secession of any Western Canadian province is very close to a zero likelihood. But in Canada, because we've all lived all our lives with the threat of Quebec secession, it's a card that people like to play. It's a rhetorical threat more than a real possibility. But obviously, when people are talking about leaving the country, that suggests that the regular day-to-day political debate's not going very well.
And conversely, though, we've seen the Quebec sovereignty movement losing steam. What's driving that?
There's not a present or recent grievance to drive Quebec sovereignty. It happens that the Separatist Party in Quebec, the Parti Québécois, which competes for power at the provincial level, is very popular. Other parties are getting kind of worn out. The young leader of the Parti Québécois is, very talented political performer. But again, it's not the arrival of Carney that's changed things. It's the return of Trump. And the return of Trump presents a greater threat and something that's just very obvious to most Quebec voters, which is that it's a dumb idea to talk about leaving Canada now when President Trump wants all of our part of the continent, because a seceding Quebec would find itself coveted by Trump, and an annexed Quebec would be much worse off in the United States than it ever was in Canada. It's amazing to me that I'm even extending hypotheticals out this far, but that's the kind of conversations that people are having routinely these days in Canadian cities. Like, well, if we left Canada, we'd be swallowed up by Trump and that would be worse. Like, that's small talk these days in Canada.
So as we know, the next prime minister will inherit a strained relationship with the United States, something that really Canadians of my generation, probably even my parents' generation, haven't faced. Carney has signaled his willingness to negotiate with President Trump, but only, and I'm quoting him, on our terms as a sovereign country, not as what President Trump pretends we are, unquote. Pierre Poilievre, meanwhile, is more ideologically aligned with the president, but he too must defend Canada's sovereignty and national dignity. How might that relationship evolve depending on which candidate ends up leading the government?
It's almost impossible to predict. And as Poilievre realizes that he could lose this thing because of the Canada-US relationship, he started to repeat more and more often what I think a lot of Canadians believe, which is that no Canadian can affect President Trump's choices. And so picking the best person to stand up to Trump is like picking the best person to stand up to the weather. But again, there's a sense among Canadians that our long-term choices vis-a-vis the United States can't only be about Donald Trump. They have to be decisions about a country that was capable of electing Donald Trump twice, might elect J.D. Vance or Vivek Ramaswamy or some other person whose logic is simply incomprehensible to Canadians, and who doesn't plainly have the faintest interest in being a reliable partner and, frankly, somebody that Canada can freeload off the way we have freeloaded off the United States for generations. And so that drives at least a rhetoric, and perhaps it's going to have to drive long-term choices towards greater independence, greater state capacity within the United States, greater state capacity within Canada, and much stronger relationships with much more distant countries in Asia and in Europe. I think all of that is going to be much easier said than done. It's going to be a much greater challenge than Canadians and even than Canadian leaders anticipate. And it may not be possible. We may end up having to do whatever the Americans want just because the gravitational pull of that huge economy is very hard to resist. Canadians are not talking like a country that's having a bad month. Canadians are talking like a country that has to turn the page on a reality that we all thought was a given for all of our lives, and we're casting about for something different and new.
Speaking about something different and new, or perhaps a return to something that existed in the early 20th century and before, Carney chose the European capitals of Paris and London over Washington for his first official visit as Canada's leader. That decision clearly signaled an intent to leverage Canada's relationship with the EU over, as you've just said, an untrustworthy United States. Given the delicate relationship between the two North American neighbors, could we see under potential Carney leadership a move towards a more preferential partnership with the European Union and its member states over the relationship with the US?
We certainly could, but it would take so much more work than Canadians, including Canadian elites, seem to understand. I spent a lot of time talking to European diplomats stationed in Ottawa, and they're flabbergasted at how little attention and bandwidth European issues, development issues, international cooperation, how little any of that gets in Canada. We are, like the Americans, quite an insular country, and to the extent that we have a foreign policy, it's an American policy. Unfortunately, it was seen as highly symbolic that Carney went to London and Paris and spent less than a day on the ground on the European continent in total. That does not begin to make up for years of benign neglect in those relationships and in relationships with the Nordic countries, with Poland, with the Iberian Peninsula. It's a big place, and Canadians are mostly strangers there. What Carney should know better than almost anyone, because he led a central bank through Brexit, is that it's infernally difficult to turn away from a market that represents 500 million people who are more like you than anybody else on earth. I mean, post-Brexit Britain does not yet have a free trade deal with Canada. How Canada can expect overnight to make itself Europe's best friend is an expression of deep naivete. And so far, in the context of the election campaign, mostly what we're hearing are expressions of preference rather than credible plans for making these huge changes happen.
That would argue that really any change is going to take years and lots of effort, which means that Canada needs to ensure some sort of continued relationship with the United States as it simultaneously seeks to develop other relationships in other markets. Are those two goals contradictory, or can the country do both at the same time?
They're obviously contradictory. It's a lot like a divorce with continued cohabitation. The United States will continue to be one of the most important facts in Canadian public life and in the Canadian economy. I mean, to me, the parallels are to things like the decades-long, extraordinarily tense relationship between Russia and Finland, or the lately sunnier relations between Germany and Poland. But I mean, you have to get along. You have to sell your exports to your neighbor. You have to work together in dealing with natural disaster and other calamities. The easy assumption of first refusal, the sort of first draft pick, to use a hockey analogy, that goes away. And so you do have to do both at the same time. And even as I talk through it, I'm aware that the complexities are vast and we've barely begun to contemplate them. And the temptation, look, if Donald Trump loses the midterms and then the Republicans lose the next election, the temptation to treat everything that's just happened as a passing scare will be great. Right now, as I speak, Canadians think that we simply can't continue to put all of our eggs in the American basket.
President Trump has repeatedly talked about Canada as the 51st state. And he's also expressed a tremendous interest, not even ruling out the use of military force, to acquire Greenland, both for its strategic geographic position in the Arctic and for its critical minerals, of which Canada has an abundance as well. Canada has finally woken up to the need to exercise greater sovereignty over its vast Arctic region, with modernization of NORAD moving forward, and both Carney and Poilievre have pledged to build a military base in the north. Will the Arctic be an area of cooperation or competition with the United States?
It'll have to be both. I mean, NORAD is a binational alliance with the United States, and it presents vital strategic capabilities that Canada can't carry on its own. So it's funny, even as we talk about turning away from the Americans, in the Arctic, NORAD is essentially the only game in town and likely to be the dominant game for some time to come. Other NATO countries are interested in partnering with Canada in the Arctic. Obviously, the Nordic countries have extraordinary capability in that area. Since it seems like we can all trust each other, there's likely to be more Nordic presence in the Canadian Arctic. What I have seen, even in my own time as a political journalist, is that it's possible for Canada to make really significant strides in the Arctic precisely because it has done so little in the past to project its state capacity that far north. So when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, Canadian military exercises every thaw season, which is, basically from April to October, became more and more ambitious in the Arctic, including quite high into the Arctic. And that leaves a legacy that can be built upon. Again, Justin Trudeau showed no interest in that effort for many years. We're all starting to see that that kind of neglect isn't cost-free. And I think that whoever is the Prime Minister will continue that strong effort to project Canadian state presence as far north as possible, as often as possible.
Paul, thanks for joining us on 35 West. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
It was fun. Thank you very much.
And that's it for this week's edition of 35 West. We hope you enjoyed listening and that you'll stay tuned for future episodes.